Rise by T. Snyder. Chapter 26. 7 days later. Elix Vassal, Eden Island, 2018. If, in fact, there were ever some manner of God or Maker, and if, in fact, that being happened to abide the dogma of Christian Scripture and created the world in 6 glorious days, only to rest upon the 7th, then I was proud to have been able to destroy that God's world in a similar length of time. Rebuilding it, however, would not be a matter of days, weeks, months, or even years, but decades, lifetimes, centuries, and beyond. For as profound a movement of survivors as I would lead to remake mankind and define the future generations of this world to be, the magnitude of the footprint of the dead world we had once inhabited would not simply vanish in the tide of our return. Instead, it would haunt the minds of those who lived equally as much as the undead, would roam the city-sized graveyards and decaying infrastructure of this doomed and rotting world. And as I sat in the comfort of my secluded office, gazing in wonder at the satellite footage I alone was privy to, I could not help but smile in elation from the sights of carnage that I had not only endeavored to create, but had boldly foreseen decades before, exactly as they were today. New York City, from the vantage of directly overhead, appeared more like an ant farm or an hourglass full of quivering sand than it did a bustling metropolis. For now, after every living soul had been infected, the undead packed every single inch of every single street, eventually flowing out onto bridges and spilling over into the bodies of water surrounding them. Tokyo was pitch black for the first time in decades, no longer a burning neon bulb of overpopulated sheep, but rather a festering pit of death and destruction. Russia, despite its monumental size and iron populace, had fallen just as easily as had the rest of the world, though to their panicked and stubborn credit, they at least were able to launch a nuclear weapon at themselves before succumbing to the disease, effectively erasing millions of undead on a landmass I had no intention of paying any mind to for decades or perhaps even longer. And as I zoomed in on the smoldering crater that was left behind from the blast, I grinned widely, recalling the many nights I had spent alone planning for this day and the countless hours of careful deliberation it had required. If not for the gradual decommissioning of nuclear power plants across the globe over the course of the past decade, radiation from the abandoned and potentially compromised plants after the infection struck would have posed a far greater threat to remaking the world than even the undead themselves. However, thankfully, I had had the foresight to use my substantial position of power while at Eden Corporation to ensure that by the time I made the decision to provoke my removal from the company and subsequently retire to my private island, all the pieces of the puzzle would be in place. Electrical grids, including those that were recalibrated into smart grids, were sure to fail within 6 to 12 hours after the infection. They did, leaving only the few solar and wind-based power sources that I needed at various locations across the globe to allow for my continued omniscient presence. For during my time at Eden Corporation, I had placed an extra emphasis on the development of unmanned drone programs, originally utilized by the American military to bomb any country it didn't feel inclined to officially declare war on. In my opinion, though, these automated drone programs were far better suited for private interests, such as my own. And now, with air bases available to me within striking distance of every country, powered and serviced without the aid or liability of human workers, the decrepit, infested world and its destruction was literally at my fingertips. However, as painstaking the task of all that I had endeavored to do, I would have to wait until those around me were prepared to take the next step before I could lead them to it. In the 7 days since the infection struck, the full magnitude of what had happened and the loss of everything and everyone in the outside world had taken its toll on those around me. My servants and security detail were dismayed, to say the least. Despite their functionality when it came to things like feeding me or catering to my every demand, they remained ultimately of no significance whatsoever. Instead, the future of the world I would rebuild rested upon the shoulders of my immediate family, who, despite my best efforts to cheer up and reach out to, remained as dreary and melancholy as everyone else. While I did worry about them, I remained nevertheless confident that in time they would not only come to forget the wretched world as it had been, but to appreciate the opportunity to make it anew. To be completely honest, though, while I did genuinely love my son and had convinced myself I loved my wife, even their immediate emotional plight was not what burdened my thoughts or occupied my attention most. Instead, as I stared at the satellite footage of large vessels approaching the visible perimeter of my island, it was the thoughts and well-being of those that I had instructed to come here that I apprehensively pondered. Every year, I hosted an annual charity event that entailed sailing across the Pacific Ocean at precisely this time of year. And every year, I encouraged, and in this case demanded, that very particular friends of mine participate in the affair. Together, the 18 yachts of size that varied from a casual sailing retreat to luxury cruise liners had not only set out across the ocean together, free of the disease I would later release, but were now approaching the doorstep of my sanctuary that I had prepared for them, despite their firm beliefs that it was fortune alone that had brought them here. In fact, a great many were nearly as rich, powerful, and influential as I, though not a single one had been worthy of my full trust or confidence, keeping even from them the extent and magnitude of my plans. I had humored their ambitions of global power by attending their petty Bilderberg meetings, which they were convinced would determine the fate of the world, and visiting their parties in their frivolous Bohemian grove, celebrating their own elitist, self-assured omnipotence, while ultimately I knew all along that their plans, their bloodlines, and their egos would be sacrificed at the dawning of the new age. However, since they had proven formidable in their influence and remarkable in their wealth, their friendship was something I had acquired solely to secretly betray and then seemingly repay by inviting them to my island, where, once here, they and what remained of their power would become my pawns. I pushed my chair away from my desk and dimmed the lights of the multiple screens that I had been watching, turning my sights for the exit where, just as I had expected, a firm knocking tapped against the door. I stood up, walked to the exit, opened the door, and pretended to be annoyed that someone had disturbed me, knowing very well that it would be a guard reporting the sighting of ships on the horizon. "Sir, my apologies for disturbing you, but we've spotted a fleet of ships off the east side of the island approaching the port," a guard informed me, apprehensive in his tone, but subordinate nevertheless. Have you established radio contact? We've been trying, sir, but they haven't been responding. All right, let's go, I stated, stepping out of my private control room and closing the door behind me. The guard walked briskly down the halls of my mansion, no doubt of the impression that what was happening would either mean the death of us all by infected vessels, or many more people would soon be joining us on the island. For while I had shared with my family the details of the ships that would be arriving, I did not feel it was necessary to share the full extent of my foreknowledge with anyone else, choosing instead to keep them on edge at all times, and by doing so, use their fear at my disposal. The port of Eden Island was capable of docking every vessel that was approaching. However, despite my confidence that some semblance of order would be maintained if I allowed them to dock, I decided it best to keep the ships anchored at sea and only allowed daily passage to and from the island with a strict curfew, effectively choking the freedoms and liberties of those who would soon be my guests. And though the rich and powerful are capable of many things, they are rarely able to accept the loss of their influence or any restrictions that are placed upon them. No doubt, they would deeply resent their segregation from those on dry land. However, due to their private security companies, hordes of anonymous servants and unchecked party guests that had accompanied them through their trip, the safety of not only those who lived on this island, but my continued control over them, depended on keeping external influences to a minimum. No one would be allowed to bring armaments from their ships onto dry land. That would remain the territory of myself and the security forces that I employed. No one would be allowed to build or develop anything on dry land without my consent, or for that matter, come to think of it as if it were their home, as their unfettered property to do with as they pleased. This was still my island, and though I intended to be gracious in every way, I expected everyone to remain afraid of the possibility of infection and abide every demand that I made under the timeless guise of doing so for their own safety. Anxious guards stared down telescopic binoculars, able to clearly see the decks of the approaching ships despite the significant distance from us. However, as I entered the spacious port complex they were currently occupying as a central command for security on the island, their attention was unanimously pulled from what they had been doing, waiting for their orders and my say-so. The commander of my guards, whom I neither liked nor made a point of seeing often, stood at attention waiting to be briefed on the situation. His name was Nahuel, a beast of a man both in body and spirit, standing 6'6", weighing nearly 300 pounds of muscle and covered in scars and tattoos. It was not his looks nor his demeanor, however, that had persuaded me to employ him for the many years, but rather it was the depths of not only his brutality, but also his loyalty. Nahuel had personally killed and tortured on behalf of many good friends of mine, and though I had yet to make similar requests of him, I knew well where his allegiances stood, just as well as he knew that if he ever faltered in them, he would pay not only with his life, but that of his family, serendipitously present on the island, alive and well. "Sir," Nahuel grunted, saluting me as he had grown accustomed to doing with the generals and tyrants he once worked for. 17 ships in total, all of them privately owned, each registered to the manifest of vessels that sailed in your charity event, he explained, seemingly annoyed that he would not have the opportunity to kill any of their passengers. There were 18 ships registered on the manifest, I replied, making sure to appear slightly surprised by the events of the day, while in fact I was actually surprised that one ship was unaccounted for. "Yes, and there are only 17 on the horizon," he stated, his tone cold and detached as always. "Strange that they would find us, no? Had I not sent them our coordinates, it certainly would be," I answered, clicking through the manifest of ships displayed on a monitor to try and locate the missing one, eventually pulling the cursor to the vacant slot of the Truth's Blessing, a large ship owned by an extroverted oilman and an inflammatory billionaire that among those sailing the seas was of the least liked and respected. I released a muffled breath of relief, glad that no one of significance was unaccounted for. I never heard back from them. If I had, you would have been informed immediately, I continued, giving Nahuel an excuse that he could believe. Will they be permitted to dock? He asked, clearly of the opinion that doing so would be a grave mistake. I did my best to hide my desire to grin, appreciating the value of his concern. For in the week since the infection struck, not only had the depth of anarchy that had consumed the world burned in the minds of those around me, but so too did the paranoia that a similar fate may befall us as well. For it was now, apart from those with religious superstitions, widely assumed that a disease had heralded the apocalypse. And with a few careful words and choice facts, I was able to ingrain this in the minds of everyone on the island, effectively making them as afraid of outsiders as they were of the undead themselves. No, Nahuel, they will not be permitted to dock, I stated, glancing at the unnerved expressions of the other men in the room, guns in hand and ready to move. Have them anchor their vessels half a mile from the dock, and then send every ship we have out to blockade them immediately, I instructed, stepping to the side of a telescope to look out to sea, recognizing the distraught expressions of the approaching ship's passengers. Do not treat them as if they are a threat, or be anything but gracious towards them. However, for our safety and theirs, it is best that they remain under strict watch at all times, and are only permitted to come to the island in limited numbers with my consent. Teams of 4, Nahuel shouted, startling the men around us, who immediately rushed out of the building to reach their boats. I waited a moment until the room was cleared before continuing my address to Nahuel. Also, there's one passenger in particular that I'd like to speak with and have brought onto the island as soon as possible, I explained, walking back to the computer console to pull up the passenger list from the approaching vessels, scrolling down until I found the picture of an old friend of mine. Of course, Nahuel replied, seemingly pleased that I had made the unyielding and unaccommodating decisions that I had. His name is Gregory Wuston, I continued, putting in motion the next play of my pawns. And between you and me, all of our lives may depend on him.